At 28,251 feet, or 8,611 meters, K2 is the second highest mountain on Earth. But if you ask anyone who knows anything about mountains, K2 is the true king of the 8,000-meter peaks. The little bit that it lacks in height is more than made up for in every other respect that makes a mountain difficult and dangerous. The slopes are steeper, the weather is worse, and the climbing is more technical. It's for this reason that despite having less than a tenth of the ascents of Everest, K2 has more than a third of the deaths. Despite being almost 1,000 feet lower than Mount Everest, K2 is unanimously known for being a far greater challenge. It's often even called the most difficult or most dangerous mountain on Earth. But in reality, definitively calling one mountain the most difficult is a tricky thing to quantify. There are a variety of factors that can be used to justify this ranking, like how remote the mountain is, how steep the routes are, how technical the climbing is, or how much of the climb is above the death zone. Looking at the numbers, there are 3 mountains among the 14 8,000-meter peaks that seem to be more dangerous than the rest. In third is Nanga Parbat, with a death-to-ascent ratio of roughly 20%. Second is K2, with a death-to-ascent ratio of roughly 26%. And first is Annapurna 1, with a death-to-ascent ratio of 32%. But K2 remains close to the top, and many of the world's best climbers share the sentiment that it's the most dangerous. So what makes K2 so fearsome? K2 is the second highest mountain, meaning that the amount of death zone climbers need to travel through is second only to Everest. K2 is also remote. There are few towns or roads nearby, so getting to the base is a challenge all on its own. It's also the farthest north of any of the 8,000-meter peaks, meaning it's colder and the weather is worse. It's also known for being unrelentingly steep, with any route up averaging 45 degrees from the base all the way to the summit. It also has an increased risk of avalanches and rock falls. On Everest, it's common not to wear your helmet most of the time. On K2, it's the exact opposite. From the moment you're at the base, your helmet is on, and on permanently. Camping is also worse on K2 because there are far fewer flat open areas to even place tents. It's not uncommon for tents to be partially hanging over an edge. The routes themselves are also narrower, sometimes just wide enough for a footpath, often on slippery rock and ice. In the event that something does go wrong, this makes rescues a nightmare. There is barely enough room to walk, let alone carry someone down. And sometimes years go by with no successful ascents. This is in contrast to Everest, where there are hundreds of ascents yearly. Sometimes on K2, there are only deaths. The mountain was discovered during the Great Trigonometrical Survey undertaken at the beginning of the 1800s. By the mid-1800s, it reached Karakoram, which is the mountain range that K2 is a part of. In 1856, the 2 most prominent peaks in the area were sketched and given the names Karakoram 1 and Karakoram 2, or K1 and K2. Because K2 is so remote, there were no towns or even trade routes that got close enough to see it. Because of this, it was never given a name by the local populace, so the original survey name, K2, stuck. The first expedition to even attempt to get close to K2 was in 1892. Then in 1902, the first true attempt was made to reach the summit. This international expedition approached from the north side in China and ascended to a height of 21,400 feet. On this first attempt, the true logistical nightmare it is to even reach K2 was realized. From the closest populated area, it took 14 days of trekking just to reach the base. The next attempt was by an Italian team in 1909, led by the Duke of Abruzzi. His team climbed the southeast spur, now known as the Abruzzi Spur, which is the standard route today. Almost immediately, this route proved to be too difficult, so they descended and scouted around for something easier. Unfortunately, every other route seemed to be even more challenging, so they simply declared that K2 was unclimbable and left. For almost 2 decades after this declaration, not a single attempt was made on the second highest mountain on Earth. That changed when the American Alpine Club held their annual meeting in 1937. During the meeting, a proposal was made to perform a reconnaissance of K2 in 1938 and possibly attempt afterward. The team set sail from New York on April 14th for Mumbai, India. About a month later, they reached the north end of modern-day Pakistan. Then they arrived in the town of Wayil, which was at the time the end of the road. This meant they now had to walk the remaining 360 miles to reach K2. To carry all of their gear, they hired 100 porters and initially set off with 20 ponies. When the terrain became too difficult for the ponies, they were replaced with more porters. They also hired established Sherpas. Another month later, on June 12th, the expedition arrived at base camp at 16,600 feet. The porters were given their pay and told to come back in 45 days with the next load of gear. From base camp, they established Camp 2 at 17,700 feet on July 3rd. For the next 2 days, the American climbers led the way and fixed ropes, while the Sherpas carried gear up and down. Modern ascenders hadn't been invented yet, so knots in the rope were used instead. 2 days later, Camp 3 was established at 20,700 feet. Then, due to several days of bad weather, it wouldn't be until July 13th that they established Camp 4. This camp was close to an area now known as House's Chimney, an 80-foot vertical cliff at 21,500 feet. It's so steep and challenging that it took the first man 2.5 hours to climb it. Because their soft metal pitons weren't sufficient on the hard rock, he had to essentially free climb the entire section. Even once ropes were set up, it was still impossible to climb it carrying any gear. So the team created a rope system to airlift all of their gear over it. After carrying gear up this cliff, Camp 5 was established across a snowfield near the top. Then Camp 6 was established on July 19th at 23,600 feet at the base of the Black Pyramid. Almost 3 weeks into their attempt, they had only about 10 days of food and fuel left. Because of this, they decided that the 2 strongest climbers would push ahead with speed and see how far they could make it. These 2 climbers made it up the Black Pyramid and established Camp 7 on the 20th at 24,500 feet. They climbed onward the following day, but by about 5 p.m., one of the men could no longer continue. The high point they reached on this attempt was 26,000 feet, just 2,000 feet shy of the top. They left the fixed ropes in place to be used the following year and were back at base camp 4 days later. The 1938 expedition was seen as a great success. They had discovered a feasible route and got close to summiting, and most importantly, there were no deaths or incidents. However, the 1939 expedition was entirely different. From the start, the American economy was doing poorly and getting funding was impossible. The team members chosen had to be wealthy enough to pay for themselves, which meant that on average, the group wasn't as skilled or experienced. On top of this, none of the previous year's members were willing to make another attempt, so apart from some of the Sherpas, it would be an entirely new team. They reached base camp at the end of May, and the porters were paid off and asked to return on July 23rd. This gave the expedition 53 days to make it to the top of K2 and back down. On the 21st, their progress was halted when there was a brutal storm on the mountain, with 20 degrees below freezing temperatures and hurricane-force winds. This went on for 8 days, and the team could only huddle in their tents and wait it out. As soon as the storm cleared, they were back at it. By early July, they established Camp 6, climbed the Black Pyramid, and set up Camp 7 at 24,700 feet, only 3,500 feet to go. This is when the first problems started. Between the incline of the slopes and the storms and clouds, the base camp party didn't think the advance party had gotten very far. Because of this, they hadn't been moving supplies up and down. The team lead eventually had to descend all the way to Camp 2 from Camp 7 to find out what was happening. By then, people were starting to wear down. Despite this, the advance party continued higher. On the 16th, Camp 8 was established at 25,300 feet by the team lead, one other American, and one Sherpa. They spent another day moving Camp 9 slightly higher. Then, finally, on July 19th, the weather was perfect and the summit was just 2,200 feet away. At 9 a.m., they set off. A little while later, they got to an area on K2 that's legendary, known as the bottleneck. It's a narrow, sloping path that at some points reaches 60 degrees incline, treacherous on hard snow and ice. More significant is the massive overhanging ice formation above the narrow path, with large cracks that could potentially shear off at any moment. Even today, this is considered the most dangerous point on the entire route.